Chapter 5. Armand scowled ferociously as he pushed his buggy along the river. He walked through another bridge and a tunnel. It was deep and inviting, and there were iron rings over which he could hang his things, but the Paris fireboats were moored along the quay. "Comes a fire on the waterfront, and all of Paris will gather on my roof," he mumbled. So he plodded on to another bridge. He only stopped once to watch a man pulling in his fishing line, because he thought there was a big fish on the hook, but it was only a sodden shoe. "Ah, that's the way our hopes go, monsieur," Armand sadly told the fisherman. Then he began jumping up and down with excitement. "The mate to the one in my buggy," he cried. "That's it!" The fisherman yanked the old shoe off the hook and tossed it to Armand. "Oh la la, monsieur," said the hobo, "but that just goes to show we would never give up hope." At last he found a bridge shelter that suited him. He spread his canvas as carefully as a family man laying the rug in a new house. "This isn't as cozy as the room that Canary made for me," he admitted. "Funny how those black lines on the concrete kept out the draft." And he didn't sleep well that night. He kept wondering about the children. Were they warm enough? Wouldn't they be lonely? He tried to pretend to himself that he was fretting about something else. "It was my bridge," he said aloud. "They had no right to put me off of my own property. I ought to go back and assert my rights." When he woke up next morning, he noticed that a light snow had fallen during the night. He sat up and rubbed his eyes as he looked out at the quay. Paris had turned white overnight. It was a beautiful sight for those who could stand in a warm room and look through a window. What would the children do now? They'd probably play in it and get their death of cold with no grown-up to look after them. "I'll show them," growled Armand. "I'm going right back there and tell them what's what. I'd like to see them try to put me off of my own property again." So he trundled his buggy, and the wheels left wet black lines in the snow. There was no sign of life around the fireboats, but as he neared the old bridge tunnel, two women in fur coats came walking down the quay. In alarm, Armand noticed that the trail they were leaving behind them ended at the canvas propped against the wall. He quickened his shuffling steps as the two women passed. They turned their heads toward him. "Poor wretched creature," exclaimed the woman in the black fur coat. "Perhaps we could save him," said the woman in the brown fur coat. "Oh, go feed the pigeons," jeered Armand. His big footprints erased theirs in the melting snow. He pulled the canvas aside. The children were crying. "What's the matter?" asked Armand. "You still bawling because I left? You might have known I'd come back." Susie pulled Evelyn closer. "Two women were here talking to us," she sobbed. "They've gone to get somebody. They're going to take us away and put us someplace," said Paul, wiping his eyes. "And they say they're going to put Mama in jail," Susie wept. "Oh, please help us, Monsieur Armand. Please don't stay mad at Mama." Armand kept twisting his beret around on his gray head. Now the soup was spilled into the fire. He knew women like those two in the fur coats, always trying to make hobos go to work or wash their faces or read books. And now they were picking on children. Must have run out of hobos. It really wasn't his affair, but Morelli had been right. These little ones. He pulled his beret down tightly. That was it. "Morelli, start packing your loot in your cart," he ordered. "We've got to get out of here fast. Women like those two don't give up easy when they have a mind to save poor wretches." He helped the children gather together the few pans and fold the blankets. He pulled down the canvas and covered the cart with it. "But where will we go?" asked Susie. "Mama won't know where we are," cried Paul. "We can't leave Mama. She's the most of our family." "I'll come back and tell your Mama where you are," said Armand. "I've got just the right nest for you." He had to help them get their market cart up the steps. Then, because Evelyn's feet were so cold, he sat her in his buggy on top of his possessions. He pushed her down the street and across the bridges. Susie and Paul followed, pushing the cart. "If I were a big man," said Paul, "I wouldn't let those women be so bossy." "Where are we going?" asked Susie as they came to the Rue de Rivoli. "To get Father Christmas to help us?" Armand looked back. "You don't need Father Christmas to help you," he said. "You've got me. Besides, he's too busy. It's only 4 days until Christmas." "Well, will you tell him we've left the bridge?" asked Susie anxiously, "just in case he does find a way to bring us a house." "No, don't you worry," said Armand. "Leave everything to me." Instead of leading them down to the Rue de Rivoli, he waited for the automobiles to stop. He motioned the children to come alongside him with their pushcart. They crossed the street abreast, and just as they reached the curb, a taxicab splashed them with dirty slush. But they kept on, single file again. Ahead of them loomed a giant shed. It was as big as a railroad station and as black and noisy. "The Halles," Armand called back to them. "That's the big central market, where all the food comes into Paris." The children quickened their steps at the word food. "I'm hungry," said Paul. "Well, you needn't get hungry at the Halles," replied the hobo. "They sell most of the stuff wholesale, but a fellow like me can sometimes waggle some food there. I'll try my luck." They saw the whole streets were covered with black sheds. Now they had to pick their way carefully. The sheds were cluttered with crates and baskets. The pavement was slimy with torn red, white, and blue papers. They kept bumping into things because they were so busy goggling at the sights. Boxes of fruit and vegetables made walls around them. There were long alleys with endless rows of beef, sheep, and hog carcasses hanging on hooks. Men went by carrying great baskets filled with hawks' and pigs' feet and calves' heads. A man was lifting an immense box. He wore an outlandish hat which made him look like a carnival figure. "Who is he?" asked Susie, pointing. "Why does he wear that funny hat?" "He's one of the strong ones," answered Armand. "He's mighty proud of that hat because wearing it means he can carry 440 pounds at one time." "Can you?" asked Paul. Armand shuddered. "Oh, la, I'll never know," he declared. They hurried past trucks, back to the curb, and lines of desks where buyers and sellers did their business. As they came out onto the street behind the Halles, Armand met many old friends. Ragged men and women were picking through the old vegetables and fruit thrown into the gutter. "Hello, Chariot," he waved to a blurry-eyed man with his clothing held together by safety pins. "Good morning, Margarita," he greeted a woman dressed in men's clothes. "Found any diamonds in the trash cans?" Then he bumped into a six-wheeled metal cart pushed by a man with a tall hat and baggy pants. Well, if it isn't Louis," he exclaimed. "Making enough money to pay your rent in that mole tunnel off the Place Maubert." Louis grinned toothlessly. "I can get you a job today," he offered. "They need more pushers. They always do." Armand started away. "I'm pushing," he said, "and you can see I've got my own pushers with me. So long." The children hated to leave the Halles. They had enjoyed the noise and bustle. "And with all that food," said Susie, "wouldn't you think they could spare us just a little bit?" They pushed their carts past St. Eustace Church and into a street teeming with other carts. It was as if the great market had spilled into this street in streams of fish and meat stands along both curbs. Paul stopped to look in the window of a coffee shop where colorful stuffed birds of South America were posed on open bags of coffee beans. The asphalt pavement ended when the Rue de Montegrel became the Rue des Petits Caracs. Now they tramped over patterns of cobbles so tiny that they looked like mosaics. Armand stopped them when they came to a building with three black Egyptian heads trimming its front. He pointed to a narrow, winding alleyway. "Part of the old Court of Miracles," he said. "In the early days of Paris, all the beggars gathered back in there for shelter, and nobody dared bother them." He led them into the ancient alley with its dingy shops. "Why did they call it the Court of Miracles?" asked Susie. "Because it was like miracles, the way those fake beggars shed their crutches and bandages when they came back here at night," exclaimed Armand. "Then they'd feast and make merry. Even had their own king they elected." The children looked disappointed to see the rear of a great garage and some more dark stores taking the place of an old court of the beggars. I'd bet you'd be the king if they still lived here," said Paul. Armand sighed. "Oh, la, those were the good old days," he said, as if he had lived in them himself and were remembering. They left the court with its rakish memories. They passed the doorways of depleted rooming houses. In each they could dimly see a battered old stairway, barely wide enough for a child, curving up to dark halls above, or perhaps a magic tower room. Who knew? Looking up at a high window across the street, they saw a queer old lady hanging out her washing on lines stretched across the window. And her washing was 6 long red pairs of underpants and 6 long red gloves, as if she might have been the wife of Father Christmas. At last they came to an open corner fenced in by wooden boards. Above it rose the crags of buildings which were slowly torn down floor by floor. Only the tall, jagged walls were left standing like rocky mountain peaks. On some of them, one could trace the original rooms by the great squares of faded wallpaper. They could hear a clattering and banging behind the fence as if the workmen were busy at their destruction. But when Armand guided them through an opening, the children's eyes opened wide. The sandy yard was filled with makeshift tents. 2 rattle-trap automobiles were parked among them. Dark-skinned men gathered around a fire were beating on old pans with hammers. There were black-eyed women with gaudy skirts dragging over the wet sand. Children with half-wild fox faces stared at them. Then 5 dogs came bounding toward them, snarling and barking. Before they knew what had happened, Jojo sprang at the dogs. There was a flying, barking mess of fur and growls. Then a gypsy woman came running with a stick. She began beating the snarling dogs without playing favorites. They stopped fighting and howled in pain and fright. Armand grabbed Jojo and pulled him back. The gypsy woman dropped the stick and began talking to the dogs in a low, soft voice. They whined a little, then sniffed at Jojo in a friendly way, as if he had now been properly introduced. "Armand," cried Morelli, "welcome, old friend. You look as if you have come to stay for a while." She looked at the children. Paul and Susie were peeping fearfully around the tramp's back. "Welcome, little one," she said. "You will not be lonely here. I will get you something to eat." She helped Evelyn down from the buggy. "We don't come empty-handed," said Armand. He began pulling things out of his buggy. First, a bunch of celery. Next, a couple of apples. Lastly, he proudly held up a dressed calf's head. He saw the little Calsets staring at the food as surprised as if he were a magician who had lifted it from a hat. "Don't know how that stuff dropped into my buggy," he said to them, "especially with Evelyn on top. I must have brushed against something in the halls." The gypsy children closed in on the Calsets. The boys were coatless and wore patched pantaloons. The little girls were dressed in gaudy skirts that hung to the ground from under their torn coats. Their long black hair was cut in bangs over their beady eyes. But they thought the Calsets were the odd-looking ones. They fingered Evelyn's red hair. They felt Susie's dark, rough coat, then touched their own gay rags. "Your clothes look so sad," said a gypsy girl. "Bet you have happy hair." A gypsy man put down his hammer and greeted them as warmly as Morelli. "There is always room for 1 or 10 more in our camp," he said. "You can share the tent with Pietro, Armand. He is in bed there now. He doesn't like the cold, so he sleeps all winter." "Can the girls live in the van with us?" cried a gypsy girl about Susie's age. Her clothes were the brightest of all, and she wore golden rings in her ears. But her high shoes clomped like boots because they had no laces. "And you can live in our tent," the tall boy offered Paul. "It's near a bakery wall, so it's nice and warm." The gypsy girl took Susie by the hand. "My name's Tinka," she said. "What is yours?" "Tinka," repeated Susie. "What a beautiful name. I'm Susie Calset, and this is my brother Paul and my little sister Evelyn. We don't have a home anywhere." "I'll show you our home," Tinka offered. "I'll show Paul and Evelyn too." She led the Calsets through an alley of tents. In the far corner was Tinka's home. The red-headed Calsets gasped at sight of it. It was a tiny house with a domed roof and curved brown doors and shutters. Instead of sitting on the ground, it was perched on wheels. "A gypsy house on wheels," said Paul. "Now that's the kind of home I'd like to have." "We can take your house anywhere we want," said Tinka proudly. "We just hook it to the back of Uncle Nicky's automobile." Susie's eyes began to burn like blue flames. She squeezed Paul's arm. "Father Christmas' little donkey could bring us a house on wheels," she cried. "He could pull it." "Let's tell Monsieur Armand," said Paul. "Then he can tell Father Christmas what we've decided." Chapter 6. The children's desire for a house on wheels worried Armand. Now, wouldn't it take them to think up something like that? "You don't need to have Father Christmas bring you a house now," he said. "Tinka will let you live in that one with her, and Paul will be in a comfortable tent." "But we want our own house," said Susie. "A house for our own family to live in. Then we can take the wheels off so we can stay in one place." "Now let's leave the wheels on," cried Paul. "Let's keep moving to new places. I'd like to live like a gypsy." "But if you move all the time, you won't be able to go to school," Susie reminded him. Paul looked as if that was not worrying him. The inside of the house on wheels was as nice as the outside. A big feather bed filled the back of it. There were shelves running all along the walls, and brightly scrubbed copper pans hung over the tiny stove. Susie would see that the little house was the tidiest place in the gypsy camp. "We put more feather beds on the floor at night so we can all sleep here," explained Tinka. All the girls, but we can't muss anything because Mother keeps a neat house. They stayed in the house on wheels for a long time. Tinka squatted on the floor and told them stories of her travels. Every spring we go down to Provence on the Mediterranean Sea, she said. We camp among old Roman ruins and bathe in the warm streams. Will you come to Provence with us? Susie was tempted, but she shook her head stubbornly. I have to go to school, she said. I don't think Mama would go anyway. And we couldn't go without her. We're family and we have to stick together. Tinka understood. We gypsies stick together too, she said. The time went so fast that Armand had almost forgotten about the children's mother. You wait here and I'll go fetch her, he said as he noticed that it was almost dark. He hurried back through the streets where the snow had turned into water. The halls were noisier and busier than ever because most of the work there took place during the night when the great trucks rolled in from all over France, bringing food to hungry Paris. It was dark by the time he reached the bridge. He caught Madame Calcette just in time. She was already descending the steps. At first she wouldn't even listen to him. She hastened down without turning her head. But when she saw that her children and all their belongings were gone, she was only too willing to listen. She burst into tears when Armand told her about the two women. Why can't they leave me in peace with my children, she said. I'm only trying to keep my family together. It's all right, madame, said Armand, patting her shoulder. The nestlings are safe with some good friends of mine, and you will be welcome there too. I should have thought it out before. It's so much better than under the bridge. Madame Calcette stopped crying and followed him back toward the halls. I want to apologize to you, she said humbly. You are a good man. Armand felt uncomfortable. Wait until you meet my friends, he said. He was certain that she would not thank him when she saw them. All the way through the dimly lit streets, Madame Calcette followed several steps behind him. Armand knew it was because she was ashamed to be seen with a hobo, but he did not let that bother him. He had lost his pride long ago. Work at the halls had reached a fever peak. The third time he went through it, now the woman had to stay close to him so that she would not get lost. They were pushed by baskets, and once Madame Calcette was almost run over by a truck. It was a relief to get back into the dark alleys. But when Armand led his companion through the wooden fence, the woman acted in the way he had expected. Her eyes flashed wide at the sight before them. The dusky gypsies were gathered around a campfire. The building peaks rising behind them made the scene one of a lovely gypsy camp at the foot of a bare Spanish mountain instead of in the crowded heart of Paris. One of the men was playing a guitar and a girl was dancing. Behind her pranced Tinka, trying to learn the steps by heart, and the firelight fell on 3 red-headed children clapping their hands in time to the music. Gypsies, shrieked Madame Calcette. You have brought us to gypsies? Then in her shame and despair, she started sobbing bitterly into her twisted scarf. Madame, said Armand, you cry so much that you will bring down the rain. To think we have fallen so low, wept the woman. My children at home with gypsies. What is wrong with the gypsies? Asked Armand. Why do you think you are better? Are you kinder? Are you more generous? I'm honest, murmured the woman through her scarf. What good does it do to be honest if you aren't kind and generous? He asked. Then, in a softer tone, he said, You may think them thieves and wanderers, madame, but they are workers too. They are proud of their fine metal work, and they have a right to be. They are expert craftsmen. Can you mend a pan that has half of the bottom burned out? They are thieves, persisted Madame Calcette. They mean no harm, said the hobo. They don't know there's a commandment against stealing, and you've been doing a lot of talking about families sticking together. Well, we're all God's big, poor family, so we need to stick together and help each other. Madame Calcette began drying her eyes on the scarf. I have nowhere else to take the children, she admitted. The room my sister-in-law told me about is more than I can pay. I must be grateful for shelter, I guess. The gypsies received her courteously, and Morelli even offered to tell her fortune, although Madame Calcette refused. Tinka brought her a bowl of stew to eat by the fireside. It's good pigeon stew, she explained. My Uncle Nicky catches them in the square. He has very swift hands. Madame Calcette looked distastefully at the stew, but Hunker triumphed. It is really very good, she admitted after the first spoonful. The 3 children gathered around their mother's skirts. It is so much nicer here than under the bridge, said Paul. And you must see the darling little house on wheels, cried Susie. Monsieur Armand is going to tell Father Christmas to bring us one. You may sleep in it, Morelli politely told Madame Calcette. There's a soft bed for you and your girls in the back. You are very kind, said Madame Calcette. But I expect to pay you for our stay here. We do not take money from our friends, said Morelli proudly, only from strangers. Then she disappeared from a tent. Susie found it more fun to sleep on a feather bed on the floor with the gypsy children. Early the next morning, Madame Calcette returned to her job. Later, the gypsy men left to canvass the restaurants for more pots and pans to mend. I guess you are having your Christmas vacation from school now, Susie said to Tinka, since the children remained in the courtyard. We have vacation all the time, said Tinka. We don't go to school. Susie was shocked. Then how do you learn to read and write? She asked. We don't know how to read and write, said Tinka. Susie was even more shocked. Then I will teach you, she said. We will have school this morning. She brought out her well-rubbed piece of coal. She had plenty of black walls to use for a blackboard. She carefully printed each letter of the alphabet, naming it as she wrote. Armand was stretched out on the ground with a piece of firewood for a pillow. He was watching the little schoolteacher with good humor. You the one who's been writing all those signs on walls and posts telling folks to go home? He asked. Susie gravely shook her head. Then she held the coal out to Tinka. Now you copy them, she ordered. Tinka gave her a fox-like grin. Below Susie's letters, she quickly drew 2 circles, one inside the other. Susie frowned. That isn't a letter. It doesn't mean anything. Oh, yes, it does, said Tinka, grinning. If you see that sign near a gate, it means that the people who live inside are good and generous. She quickly scratched an upright line, then crossed it with 2 short bars. But that sign means that beggars will be badly received. Perhaps the people will even set the dog on them. Armand came to life. I'll remember that, he said. Seems like I went to the wrong school. Never learned such useful reading. Tinka laughed. She mischievously batted her eyelashes at Susie. See, she said, there's some writing you can't read. Susie was willing to be a pupil as well as a teacher. I like to learn new things, she told Tinka. Now you teach me some more gypsy writing? Armand swiftly rose to his feet. It's getting too highbrow for me around here, he said. Think I'll take a little walk over town. This time the children did not plead to be taken along. They were no longer bored and lonely. Although Paul and the boys had quickly lost interest in Susie's school, they were all playing a game of wolf and sheep behind the tents. But Susie had one request. Will you please go to the Louvre store, Monsieur Armand? She asked, and tell Father Christmas where to bring our house, and that will be satisfied if he brings us a little one on wheels like Tinka's. Armand nodded. That's right, he remembered. Not much time left. Tomorrow night is Christmas Eve. Chapter 7. The day before Christmas, the little Calcettes could talk about nothing but the house on wheels which they expected Father Christmas to bring them. Even the gypsy children were excited about it. Then you'll surely come to Provence with us in the spring, tempted Tinka. Pietro's car can pull your house. We'll all make the pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Sarah. Who is Saint Sarah? Asked Susie. I've never heard of her. Tinka was amazed. If you went to school, she said, I should think you should have learned more. Don't you know that after the crucifixion, St. Mary Jacob and St. Mary Solemn were seized by the enemies of Christ and set adrift in a boat without any rudder or sails? And of course St. Sarah was with them because she was their handmaiden. The wind blew their boat to the shores of Provence, so now there's a church there, and St. Sarah's statue is in the crypt. The gypsies make a pilgrimage there in May because St. Sarah was a gypsy. I want to see St. Sarah, said Evelyn. I want to see the Mediterranean Sea, said Paul. I would like to see all of those things too, said Susie wistfully. But we'll have to finish our school first. We can't go to school until we get a home, Paul reminded her. Remember what Mama said? But we'll have a home when school starts, said Susie. Father Christmas is going to bring our house tonight. Armand groaned. If only he could get them off the house idea. How would you like to go to a Christmas Eve party tonight? He asked. A big party with food and singing and hundreds of people. As he had expected, the Calcettes immediately forgot their house on wheels. Where? Asked Paul. In a big palace? Not exactly, replied Armand. It's to be held under the Turnelli Bridge. Paul's face fell. But it will be a grand party, I can promise you, went on Armand. The Notre Dame church people give it every Christmas Eve for all the hobos of Paris and their ladies. They'll sing carols, eat sauerkraut and wieners. Paul was happy again. "I like to eat," he said, "and I like to eat sauerkraut and wieners best of all." "Maybe Mamma won't let us go," said Susie. "She can go too," said Armand. "After all, it's for homeless people, so that makes her a distinguished guest." "Can the gypsies go too?" asked Susie. "I'd like to take Tinka." But the gypsies said they had their own plans for Christmas Eve. Tinka only grinned and acted secretive when she was questioned about them. Strangely enough, Madame Calcette agreed to go to the holiday party under the bridge. "I can do so little for the children this year," she said, "and they have some crazy idea that Father Christmas is going to bring them a gypsy van. Perhaps the party will make them forget." But even though the gypsies refused to go to the party, Nicky offered to drive them there in his rattletrap car. "I've some business and the Jardin des Plantes park and have to take the car out anyway," he explained. The Calcettes were thrilled. They had never ridden in an automobile. They clung tightly to the seats. Jojo sat erect as if he were quite used to it. Nicky raced down the narrow streets and shouted insults at pedestrians and cars that got in his way. His own car sputtered, rattled, and clanked as if it would fall apart at any moment, but it didn't. It was a cold, clear night, and all the monuments were floodlighted. The streetlights threw golden ribbons across the Seine. The old car rattled across the Tournelle Bridge, then stopped at the curb. The Calcettes jumped out quickly. Armand stiffly backed out. Jojo made it in one leap. From the head of the steps, they could look down on the party. As Armand had predicted, it was crowded. A large tent had been raised on the quay, a tent that would have delighted the gypsies. Young boys and girls of the parish were carrying out pans of steaming food from the tent. The warm smell of sauerkraut was overpowering. It delighted Paul most of all. "Let's hurry down before they eat it all up," he urged. But Susie's eyes were looking across the river to the little isle of the city, where Notre Dame was illuminated like a saint's dream. Its flying buttress and tail and tall, fragile arrow were frosted with light. "Isn't it beautiful?" sighed Susie. "It looks like it was made in a bakery shop, doesn't it?" But Madame Calcette had turned around to look up at the fashionable restaurant rising over the bridge, a man-made cliff honeycombed with lights. "There are rich people in beautiful clothes sitting at white tables up there," she said enviously. "And paying a lot of money for rich food that's going to give them indigestion," said Armand. "Come on, that sauerkraut smells like a feast to me." When they reached the bottom of the steps, they could see that the tunnel was even more crowded than the quay. Canvas had been stretched across the far end to cut off the draft. There were colored ribbons fastened to it. A decorated tree stood on a high stage made of boards. Charcoal heaters had been set around to warm the air, and many of the ragged guests were huddled over them. Others sat on the curb greedily, eating out of tin bowls, and some lady hobos were sitting with their backs against the bridge, talking about politics and trash cans and chilblains. But most of the hobos only stood around waiting for something to happen. Armand cornered a young girl carrying some tin bowls. "Right here," he said. "This is where we said we'd be waiting for you." He made room for the Calcettes to sit along the curb, but Madame Calcette remained standing. "I'll help you carry out the food," she offered the girl. "I'm not really a tramp." Besides sauerkraut and wieners, there was soup, pork, cheese, and oranges. Armand ate until he felt as if he could burst. They took turns feeding tidbits to Jojo. "Have to store up like the camel for next Christmas Eve," Armand told the children. They needed no urging, but Susie kept asking, "When are we going back?" "Don't you like the party?" asked Armand. "Look, there's a man on the stage who's going to play the accordion so we can all sing carols. You don't want to go now, do you?" "Not really," said Susie. "Just that I can't wait to see if Father Christmas brought us the gypsy house." Armand stopped gnawing on a wiener. There it was again. Now the nestlings would go back to the courtyard only to be bitterly disappointed. He couldn't bear the thought of spoiling this wonderful night with its free food and entertainment. He lowered his voice. "Listen," he said to the children. "Father Christmas made me promise not to tell you this, but there isn't going to be any house on wheels for you. Too many gypsy children asked for them this year, so we didn't have any left over." "No home for us?" asked Susie in a quivering voice. The flickering light up from the charcoal burners made the tears in her eyes sparkle like diamonds. "You mean he's not going to give us any kind of a house?" "I don't mean that at all," parried Armand. "Oh, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but the truth of it is he's having a house built for you out in Nully, and it isn't finished yet. You don't build a house during a few Christmas holidays, you know. It takes some time. They haven't even got the plumbing in yet." Susie's eyes shone brighter than the diamonds. A real house? She asked in a hushed voice. A house growing out of the ground? Armand nodded, but not a word. To your mamma, he said. Remember that. I shouldn't have told you. I gave Father Christmas my solemn promise that I would keep it a secret. But the children were kept too busy to tell their mother, and Madame Calcett was kept quite busy herself because more hobos had come to the party than had been expected. But it is easy to stretch sauerkraut and wieners. Then the crowd of hobos and their ladies and friends sang Christmas carols to the accordion music. Most of their voices were cracked and off-key, but they sounded beautiful to themselves. Armand was ready to go by midnight. He clung to the big carton that had been given to him at the tent as a gift. He knew it was full of jam, fruit, and cigarettes. It would be his Christmas present to the gypsies. But Madame Calcett wouldn't think of going straight back. We must go to the midnight mass on the quay, she said. The girl told me about it. An altar had been set up on the Turnelli quay right out in the open. The priest in his bright vestments, followed by his altar boys, had just approached the altar by the time Armand and the Calcetts arrived. Many of the hobos stayed for the mass. Evelyn fell asleep in her mother's arms. Jojo was quiet and respectful, although it was the first time he had ever been to church. Armand swayed from one foot to the other uneasily. It had been so long since he had gone to Mass. Lucky this one was out here on the quay. They never would have pulled him into one of those great fancy churches. The hobo had other things to make him uneasy. The plight of this family, just how had he got himself so tied up with them? How had he blundered into such a trap? It was the way those starlings had begged him to stay with them. That is how they had stolen his heart. No one had ever made him feel needed before, and now he'd lied to them. There wasn't any house growing out of the ground, not for them. In his misery he raised his eyes high over the altar, up to the stars in the pear sky. Please, God, he said, moving his lips soundlessly, I've forgotten how to pray. All I know now is how to beg. So I'm begging you to find a roof for this homeless family. Then he was ashamed to notice that he was holding his beret up in his usual begging way. He quickly pulled it over his head. When they got back to the camp in the early morning hours, they found all the gypsies awake, even Pietro. They soon learned why. Look, cried Tinka. With delight, she pointed to a beautiful evergreen tree in front of the gypsy house. Merry Christmas, she cried. The tree was an unusual gray-green with needles as soft as feathers. Fastened to its graceful branches were little packages tied in red, white, and blue papers that looked as if they might have been picked up near the halls. On top of the tree hung a copper star, like the patch the gypsies used for mending pots and pans. I bet that tree is the freshest, prettiest one in Paris, boasted Nicky. I cut it down in the Jardin des Plantes only a few hours ago, and the sign near it said it was a very rare tree from India. The gypsy children tore the little packages off the tree and gave them to the Calcetts. They held nuts, candies, and small celluloid toys. We like to give presents, said Tinka. Perhaps that's because one of the wise men who brought gifts to the Christ child was a gypsy. I never heard that before, said Susie. Tinka looked at her with Shargan. What did you learn in your school besides those letters? She asked. But before Susie could answer, Armand was presenting his carton of goodies to the gypsies. He generously added that it was from the Calcetts too, but the biggest surprise was for him. Madame Calcett brought out a small package neatly wrapped in newspaper. A fragrant smell hovered around the gift. He opened it to find a glossy pink bar of soap. He looked at it for a long time. He sniffed it thoughtfully. Just what I needed. He politely thanked her.